All right, thanks for joining me. So today we're gonna review another CyberPowerPC. This one is the Gamer Xtreme VR. Anyways, so this one has a 14700KF, I think, on it. No, it's just a 14700F, so not overclockable. It only has 16 gigs of DDR5 for the RAM, but it is at 6000 megahertz, so we'll take a look at that. And it's got the RTX 5060 Ti 16 gig in it, and I got it for about $1,200 after tax. We're gonna open this thing up, take a look at everything, see what we really got, and see if it's really worth it. All right, I'll be right back. As you may or may not know, I've bought pre-builts on Best Buy, on Facebook Marketplace, at Walmart. I don't think I've done Newegg yet, but this one I got on Amazon. And I got it on Prime Day as a Prime Day deal. It didn't have any special deals other than the Prime Day price, but I thought it was a pretty good deal for the price it was at. Like I said, after tax, I spent about $1,200. And I thought it was a pretty good deal considering the price. So the packaging is pretty similar to the other CyberPowerPC I did. It's actually a pretty decent keyboard. It's actually a better quality keyboard than the one from the Gamer Supreme. Here we got the quick start guide, similar to the other CyberPowerPC that we got. And just like in the other CyberPowerPC, it's pointing to a DVI port. Still a little funny. It does have instructions on here, how to remove the side panel and things like that. It has like a QR code for more information and to register the PC. I think the Gamer Supreme one came with like a little dongle, a USB dongle. It does come with it, so yeah, and the same free $10 times 2 thing. Here's the Wi-Fi antenna, and it comes in white. Nice little match set, right? And a power cable. And here's the mouse. Tell me if you guys want to know more about accessories and things like that on future PC reviews. Honestly, I'm not a big fan of front panels like this, especially if you've got front fans, but this one doesn't have front fans. It does have their standard sticker to make sure that you attach your monitor to the GPU and not the iGPU in the system, which this one doesn't have because it is a 14700F. Right, so feels like these screws are a little bit too tight, or a lot of it too tight to loosen by hand, which kind of defeats the purpose of calling it a thumb screw. Okay, so it sits on a kind of a thin lip, which so you want to be careful with this side panel because it is glass. It does have metal on the bottom of it, but it's just this tab right here that's attached to it right there. But your bottom edge isn't metal. So if you drop this thing by accident while removing the panel, you could break that glass, so just be careful. And so it looks like your standard protected GPU packaging. Wasn't really all that tight in there, just kind of sitting a little bit loose there, but okay. And we get a loose wire tie. Who knows where this came from? But it does look like it was torn off. Also of note, there's only a single channel RAM here, right? So just be aware of that. And it has an air cooler instead of an AIO. So there's some of your cost cutting as to why the price is a little better than expected. Top panel IO. So you get the power reset button, indicator lights, headphone mic jacks, two USB 3.0s and a USB Type-C. I'm assuming it's a 3.1 USB. Take off this sticker. Wow, on a little bit too well on the filter, and the top filter looks to be magnetic. All right, there we are in the BIOS. So it looks like from the memory frequency, they already set it to XMP. I'm assuming resize bar is on, so that's good. So as you can see here, hopefully it is set at XMP1 right there. And obviously things like optimization, max turbo, and things like that isn't going to come into play here because this is a non-K CPU. It's 14700F, so that's one of the other cost-cutting things about the PC. But 14700, when it comes to gaming, is more than ample. It'll last you for years from a gaming standpoint. BIOS version is F6A, so we'll take a closer look at that as far as if it's the proper version for the time that it was sold. Well, system fans look like they're pretty aggressively set. It's gonna ramp up to 100% on the fans because this is set at the normal preset at 60C. CPU fan is a little bit different, still fairly aggressive, where it's going to ramp up to 100% at about, looks like about 77C, somewhere around there. And right now our current CPU temperature is at 33C, so that's a good idle temperature right there. It looks like all the temps are reading pretty decently at idle. So we're in the system. It took a little bit longer than I anticipated, but not a bad time frame. So let's change the display settings so things are a little bit more visible for you guys. All right, so hopefully you guys can see there. I set it at 225% view. Our devices, so it looks like we don't have any conflicts, so that's good. And right here, looks like it's a Gigabyte motherboard, a B760, so not a B760M. And the reason why I'm pointing out that it's a full-size ATX board rather than a micro ATX board is because usually micro ATX boards are more cost-effective, but this is a DS3HAX V2 version. All right, so 14700F. There's our 16 gigs of RAM. We'll take a closer look at the brand and model when we start doing the teardown. Looks like we've got a Western Digital Green SN3000 1TB NVMe for our SSD, the 5060 Ti, the 16 gig version. I would have never bought the 8 gig version because that thing is practically useless, at least for the long range scheme of things. All right, so everything's looking fine. I'm gonna go off screen and do some benchmarking and some thermal tests and things, and then I'll be right back to do the teardown, and then we'll talk about the benchmarks and my final thoughts. All right, I'll be right back. All right, so as I said earlier, the top filter is magnetically set on there. And as I've said before in other reviews, I'm not a big fan of top filters like this, especially considering the porosity of this particular filter is pretty slim. I'd say maybe 30%, maybe 40%, I don't know. Anyways, I'm not a fan of it because usually this is where exhaust happens, and this one's natural exhaust, as you'll see here shortly. And so it just creates more resistance for it to properly exhaust. This thumb screw feels a little warped. We'll see here shortly when we pull the panel. And see, that's the problem with these things that don't have a way to come off safely. As you saw, it just fell right to the table. Interestingly enough, it does have another filter right here for intake, which is where the intake fans are. And that one's also magnetically placed. All right. So let's take a look here and start removing some stuff so that I can get to screws and cables. This is a PNY version of the RTX 5060 16 gig. The 8-pin connector for the PCIe was pretty secure. This screw feels really warped and hyper tightened. Well, maybe it's not warped or anything, but it was hyper tightened, which you don't need for it to be hyper tightened. You just need it to be snug. See, this is how you strip screws. Yeah, this one is put in crookedly. Maybe that was my fault. Maybe I should have taken the cover panel off first. But I think I feel a little bit justified I'm gonna take pictures of the markings here. Hopefully the picture quality on that is good enough to see. All right, so it looks like we've got our classic release mechanism right here for the GPU. And hopefully you'll be able to see how tight those screws were tightened down on this bracket. See those circles right there? Anyway, so this is a 2-fan PNY model, and it does come with 1 HDMI and 3 DisplayPort outputs. And the plastic is off on the heatsink. Something came off though. This looks like part of the wire tie that was sitting loose when we first opened the case. It was sitting right underneath the heatsink for the SSD there. So that's a little scary. The screw for the heatsink is captive, so that's nice. There's our Western Digital Green SN3000. I'll show you what it's capable of on the read-write speed here right now. All right, so let's take a look at the cables. Make sure everything's secure. So this looks like a Team Group. Yeah, Team Group T-Force Delta DDR5 16 gig. It looks like it's a CL38. I don't know if the camera's going to be able to pick that up, but 6000 megahertz CL38, which is okay. I mean, I much prefer the tighter timings of like CL30, CL28 kind of 6000 megahertz RAM. But CL38 is fine for most people. Most people won't even notice the difference. The more concerning part is it came with 16 gigs rather than 32 gigs. So that's a little bit disappointing on CyberPower's part, but considering the price points, to a certain degree, it's understandable. I'd rather see them raise up their price for the PC by another $25 or $50 and get us 2 sticks of 16 gigs for a total of 32. All right, so let's check out the screws on the motherboard. All right, looks like we're good on the motherboard for the screws. Before I forget, the PC has a bottom filter for really no reason. There's no fan at the bottom for it to protect from, I guess if it's sitting on a carpet, it protects a little bit from dust, but All you needed was enough for the power supply intake. So I don't know why they chose to do it this way. I guess there's a way to install some fans down here. At least one fan. The handle's in the back, so you kind of have to unplug everything, flip it over on its side, pull and yank to get this off to clean. So that's really not user friendly. But as you can see here, there's possibilities of mounting fans on the bottom here, but you got a bunch of cables right here that's going to block off airflow and block off from installing a fan. And then you've got over here that you could potentially install an intake fan, but it's not really going to do a whole lot. It's going to actually create some cross flow between the intakes right here and intake right here. And so it's going to go like this. And although you've got an intake right here to pull that air in, depending on the speed of the fan, it could potentially push the intake up over this way and over this way, which is fine, but it doesn't do a whole lot for cooling for the GPU area. So yeah, it might be pointless to install intake fans there. You also have the ability to install some exhaust or intake fans up top right here. Looks like up to probably 140 mil. Anyways, we're getting off track here. And here's the thermal paste. It's okay, I guess, but it's a little on the thin side, which, you know, I'm not a big fan of. I'd rather have too much thermal paste than too little thermal paste. And when I say too much, I don't mean like a whole ton of it where it's overflowing everywhere. Just a little bit more. Maybe another dab or two on the IHS. Huh. This USB-C cable came loose. I'm not sure. I'll have to check the video, the playback, but I don't remember pulling that accidentally or on purpose, but we'll see. All right. All right, got some thermal paste on there from, I don't know, from my hand or something, I don't know. I'm not a big fan of these wires coming across the back of a motherboard. Sometimes you have to just make do with what you've got, but it looks like there's plenty of room here to have loosened it up and wire tied at this tie point right here. So it came across and then possibly channel a little bit over this corner spot without it touching the motherboard. I don't like it when wires touch the back of the motherboard. Mostly, I mean, it's not a problem so much as if for some reason you get like a bare wire or something like that, or a kink in the wire where it has a little bit of bare wire or anything, you could short out a motherboard pretty quickly and possibly short out other things like CPUs, GPUs, things like that. So although it's highly unlikely it happens, better safe than sorry in my opinion. If you've got room to do the cable management smartly, right? All right, in the meantime, looks like we've got a couple of trays right here for 2.5-inch SSDs. Doesn't look like there's any spots for 3.5-inch drives, but you know, a lot of people nowadays don't really use 3.5-inch drives, but if you're upgrading from an older PC and you've got 3.5-inch drives that you want to migrate over to a new PC, this one does not afford you the ability to do so, unless, no, there's no hard drive cages. So yeah, there's no good way, I guess is the best way to say it, to install a 3.5-inch drive into this PC. All right, and cable management, as far as the excess cables and stuff. This part is really nice. You're not really blocking a lot of airflow on the intake fans right here, so that's not a big deal. And it's pretty nice and neat right here. This thing's sitting kind of loose. This is the EPS cable for the CPU power, and this might be that wire tie that was sitting loose in the PC. There might have been a wire tie right here. I don't know why they would use a wire tie since these are all zip ties. So yeah, that's I don't like that. I mean, there's tie points right here. It's not like they're running out of zip ties over there. I don't, you know, that's a little disappointing. All right, and then, like I said, you got a couple of sleds for 2.5-inch drives, and then the rest of the cables is just pretty much just shoved in here, which you don't really have a lot of choice with that kind of thing, especially in a case like this. And you know, I'm less and less of a fan of this particular case. It's on the smaller side for a mid-tower, but I really don't like what it has to offer as a tower. This is certainly not a case I would take with me into the future if I'm upgrading or migrating things. Right, enough rambling. Let's check the fan screws. Okay, fan screws are good. Looks like we've got a back plate for the power supply here. So let's check all these screws. All right, while I'm thinking about it, there is by the way, the screws are fine, nice and secure. But while I'm thinking about it, there are these two other thumb screws in the back, and that's for this side panel right here to come off. Yeah, these things were screwed in crookedly, and they're not even sitting loose, right? So they were screwed in that way. But yeah, that's to take that side panel off. It doesn't afford you any more accessibility to the power supply, but it does give you room to be able to screw down fans, or at least a fan right here. As I mentioned earlier, you could potentially put an intake fan right here. And let's check this rear exhaust fan. So they're batting 1,000 on screws being secured, so that's good. And this motherboard has a back I/O plate right here, and we'll get more into the I/O and what the motherboard has to offer. Let's see if the front panel comes off. It looks like it would. That thing is not coming off. And as you can see here, we've got, as far as the intake fans, they're all 120 millimeter fans. And there's another 120 millimeter, all RGB fans. And then you've got a pretty basic RGB fan, 120 fan for the air cooler. All right, so let's take out the power supply. And just like with the rest of the screws, they're over tightening these things. Yeah. So it looks like we've got a high power 850 watt gold, a non-modular power supply. All right, so for the rear I/O on this Gigabyte B760DS3HAX V2 motherboard. Wow, what a long name. Anyways, so the rear I/O comes with one PS2 keyboard mouse port, and I don't know why Gigabyte
insists on putting these things into their newer motherboards. I don't know very many people that are buying newer motherboards that are using a PS2 connector for their keyboard or mouse. So they must have like thousands of them laying around or something. There's also 4 USB Type A 2.0 ports, 2 at the top, 2 at the bottom. There's the 2 Wi-Fi connectors for the antenna that it comes with. There's an HDMI port. There is a display port. There is also a USB Type A 3.2 Gen 2 port. That's the red one right there. And then that smaller USB port is the USB Type C 3.2 Gen 2 port. And then there's the RJ45 port for your LAN or Ethernet cable. And that unfortunately is just a 1 gig Ethernet port. And then it's got the 3 audio jacks and no spit out.
All right, so that's everything, I think. If I forgot something to talk about while I was tearing it down, please write down in the comments and let me know. In the meantime, we're gonna put this back together, and then I'll be back with benchmark results and my final thoughts on the PC. All right, so let's get to the benchmarks. Cyberpunk 2077, and this is for the pre-2.3 version update. At 4K, we did 30.9 FPS on average with 22 FPS for the 1% lows. At 1440p, we did 61.2 average with 32.2 for 1% lows. And at 1080p, we did 75.5 average with 34.7 on the 1% lows. The CPU temperature spiked at its high point at 79C. Power draw for the CPU was 70.1 watts. The GPU's top temperature came in at 77.1C. VRAM top temperature came in at 70C. The top GPU power was 185.4 watts. The Black Myth Wukong results at cinematic settings, which is the same thing as ultra settings. At 4K, we did 38.4 FPS on average and 28.0 at the 1% lows. At 1440p, we did 44.3 FPS on average, and the 1% lows was at 32 frames. At 1080p, we did 47.4 on average and 33.8 on the 1% lows. And those scores were, at least at 1440p and 1080p, were a little bit on the close side as far as their differences go. So just in case, I tested the very high settings at 1080p, and that came in at 52.7 FPS on average and 36.7 FPS on the 1% lows. The CPU's top temperature came in at 94C. The CPU's top power draw was at 201.2 watts. GPU's top temperature came in at 74.7C. The VRAM's top temperature came in at 70C, and the GPU's top power draw was 153.2 watts. The Monster Hunter Wilds results came in at 4K, 25.9 average FPS with 8.9 FPS 1% lows. And at 1440p came in an average of 35.3 FPS. The reason why I kind of laughed a little bit was because the 1% lows came in at 7.9, which is worse than the 4K results. And at 1080p, it did 37.7 on average, and the 1% lows was at 10.2. And again, those are pretty low scores, and 1440p and 1080p were pretty close together. So I tried it at the high settings on 1080p, and that came in at 40.5 FPS on average and 21.7 on the 1% lows. The top CPU temperature came in at 83 degrees. The CPU top power draw was at 140.4 watts. The GPU temperature, top temperature was at 73.7C. The top VRAM temperature came in at 70C, and the top GPU power draw was at 150.7 watts. And for Red Dead Redemption 2 at 4K, we had 53.6 FPS on average, 26.3 on the 1% lows. At 1440p, we did 61.2 on average with 30.4 on the 1% lows. And at 1080p, we did 65.2 on average and 32.1 on the 1% lows. And again, just in case, I switched it up to the high settings at 1080p to see what the differences would be, and that came in at 69.4 on average with 30.2 for the 1% lows. CPU temperature came in at 94C. The top CPU power draw was 201.2 watts. The GPU temperature came in at 74.7 C. Top VRAM temperature came in at 70 C, and the top power draw for the GPU came in at 153.2 watts. For Steel Nomad at 4K, we did 35.1 FPS on average with 29.8 on the 1% lows. At 1440p, we did 70.2 FPS on average with 60.7 on the 1% lows. At 1080p, we did 95.7 on average with 81.1 on the 1% lows. The top CPU temperature on Steel Nomad came in at 98C, and the top CPU power draw was 200 watts. The top GPU temperature came in at 76.3C. The VRAM temperature came in at 66C, and the top power draw for the GPU came in at 180.8 watts. Running FirmArc at 4K, we came in at 65.5 on the average FPS with 44.0 on the 1% lows. At 1440p, we did 143.5 on average with 105.8 on the 1% lows. And at 1080p, we did 193.6 on average with 151.6 on the 1% lows. The top GPU temperature for FirmArc came in at 77C. The top VRAM temperature came in at 68C, and the top GPU power draw came in at 186.1 watts. I'm kind of okay with the results for Cyberpunk 2077. I was a little disappointed in the results for the other games. I'm thinking that we're CPU bound on most of these games at most of these settings. So you're probably going to want to be somewhere between the very high to medium settings with a system like this. All right, and then we did the Blender benchmark using version 4.5.0. And for the CPU side, on Monster, the result was 148.6 samples per minute. For Junk Shop, it came in at 96.7 samples per minute, and for Classroom, it came in at 68.9 samples per minute. And the top CPU temperature for that benchmark came in at 91C. The top power draw for the CPU came in at 213.1 watts. For the GPU test on Blender, for Monster, we did 2069.8 for Monster. On Junk Shop, we did 1145.3 samples per minute, and for Classroom, we did 1124.3. Top GPU temperature for that benchmark came in at 60.5C. The top VRAM temperature came in at 62C, and the top power draw for the GPU came in at 122.3 watts. Cinebench R23, the multi-core score came in at 24696 for the score, and the single core came in at 2013, both of which were well within expectations for the CPU. And the top CPU temperature came in at 94C, and the top CPU power draw came in at 219.3 watts. And then lastly, we did a shortcut for video exporting. And so we did a long form video and a short form video. We did a 20-minute video that exported at 12 minutes, 28 seconds. And we did the short video at 5 minutes, and that exported at 3 minutes, 6 seconds. The top CPU temperature for that run came in at 86C. The top power draw for the CPU came in at 101.1 watts. The top GPU temperature came in at 34.5C. Top VRAM temperature came in at 58C, and the top GPU power draw came in at 34.5 watts. All right, so let's talk about my overall thoughts on this PC. We're a little bit CPU bound on some games, and we're at 16 gigs of RAM. Also, this PC comes with a 1-year parts and labor warranty and quote unquote lifetime tech support, which is decent. It's not great. 2 years would be better. 3 years would be ideal, but 1 year isn't bad considering the price, and we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the back end as far as the price is concerned. There's also, for this motherboard, only a single EPS connector for this power to the CPU, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but at the same time, if whoever owns this PC ever wants to upgrade their CPU to say like a 14900K, you might not be able to get enough power to the CPU because you only have a single connector. The PC is pretty quiet. If you've seen my other review videos, you've seen a couple of times where I had to turn the PC off because I was afraid that the fans were too loud. And this is how it sits at the normal fan setting. I did not change the fan settings at all, and it's pretty quiet. It ramped up a couple of times during some benchmarks and things like that. You could hear it then, but it wasn't for very long. Now, was it worth it? Well, like I said at the beginning, I paid about $1,200 after tax for this PC. And so it came in at, I think, $1,155 before tax. For that price, for these components, that's not bad, especially with the 1-year parts and labor warranty. I tried to put together a system as closely as I could to this particular system, and it came in above that $1,155 pre-tax price, and so it's not a bad value. That being said, I don't think I'd recommend this. There was some build quality issues, some quality assurance issues. I've got some CPU bottlenecking where I don't believe it should be. So, and you know, it comes with 16 gigs RAM versus 32 gigs RAM. It's single stick versus 2 sticks. So there's a lot of things, but most specifically, the most concerning thing was the quality assurance. I'd probably recommend this PC if it was somewhere between $950 to $1,000. I would certainly recommend it at $900 and below, but at $1,155 to $1,200, I'm on the fence about it. I'm not a fan of the things I ran across, and I'm a little bit disappointed in CyberPowerPC for not being on top of this one. Anyways, so that's my thoughts on the PC. Tell me what you think, and if you've got this gamer Xtreme, let me know what your experience is and what you ran across, if anything, and what your thoughts are. If you're thinking about getting it, tell me what you're thinking about getting, if it's this specific version or a different version of the Gamer Xtreme. And hopefully you found this information helpful. And if you did, please hit that like and subscribe down below. It does help out the channel a ton. And in the meantime, thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you in the next one.